So earlier in the lecture we were discussing folliculitis, inflammation of the hair follicles caused primarily by some members of the genus Staphylococcus, but a more persistent, severe, and chronic condition is acne, which also involves infection of the hair follicles, is instead most often caused by a bacterium known as Propionibacterium acnes. Now this is part of your normal flora. It's what your textbook refers to as a type of diphtheroid. These, along with Corynebacterium, make up some of the actinobacteria component of the normal skin flora. Like staph and strep, they are gram-positive, but in contrast to the coxoid shape of staph and strep, these are rod-shaped. Again, they're commonly found on the skin or growing within the sebaceous glands of the hair follicles, so the bacteria shown here, where they are feeding on the sebum. Now, a number of conditions can result in increased sebum production and proliferation, overproliferation and infection of the hair follicles by these bacteria. So, depending upon some other conditions, including genetics, the typical whiteheads and blackheads can occur, or severe pustules may also develop. This is more characteristic of something called cystic acne, and this pus is really, leukocytes, dead bacterial cells, live leukocytes, etc. And the manifestation is pretty familiar. So, depending upon one's genetics and hormones, this typically begins in adolescence. Sometimes it can continue later in life, but there are a number of treatment options, including antibiotics, because it does have a bacterial etiology, exfoliation of the dead skin cells. In more severe cases, Accutane can be prescribed. This actually has the effect of reducing the amount of sebum produced, but it also can be teratogenic, causing birth defects. So this is only prescribed under certain conditions. And also under development is light therapy, both ultraviolet light, which I believe your text describes, but also blue light, which is safer. This excites certain circular molecules called porphyrins, and this results in generation of reactive oxygen species, which can kill the bacteria. Pseudomonas aeruginosa, in contrast to Propionibacterium, is an important opportunistic bacterium. This, though, is not a member of the normal flora, but instead is ubiquitous in the environment. So it's kind of hard to get away from, common in soil, moist environments, and it can grow on lots of different types of organic carbon sources. So it's kind of difficult to avoid these. The good news is they're not typically really invasive, and so they really only cause problems once they breach the first and second lines of defense. So in those cases, blood infections can occur. In fact, they can infect nearly every tissue and organ in the body. One of the diagnostic characteristics is this pigment called pyocyanin, which is believed to play a role both in allowing the bacterium to scavenge iron and also perhaps in the production of reactive oxygen species to damage host cells. Lots of different virulence factors have been described in Pseudomonas aeruginosa. Some of these involved in adhering to the host cells, evading phagocytosis, or in tissue destruction. But again, these are relatively rare in spite of their abundance, and that's because they need a real clear path to infection. Unfortunately, this is provided in burn victims in which the exposure of the vulnerable tissue underlying the epidermis really provides an ideal place and mechanism for colonization by Pseudomonas aeruginosa. You can actually see the green pigment here underneath the bandages of this burn victim, which represents this very pervasive and extensive infection of this particular patient. Unfortunately, this is hard to treat with topical antibiotics because of the crust that forms over the burns, and that normally has to be removed, and that's called debridement for those types of antibiotics to be effective. Alternatively, I think oral antibiotics are not that effective either, just because the tissue being so damaged is not well vascularized. So there's some problems with treating these infections. Let's see. Okay, well let's not forget too that Pseudomonas species in general, and maybe this was a point that you kind of picked up in lab, these tend to be really resistant to different types of disinfectants as well as antimicrobial agents, due in part to just their ability to break down lots of different compounds. They're gram-negative, so they have that outer membrane, and when they form biofilms, that extracellular polysaccharide matrix really prevents penetration of antibiotics into the layers. So later we will see that Pseudomonas aeruginosa is also able to colonize the lungs of patients with cystic fibrosis, and they do this by virtue, again, of their ability to form biofilms. So another infection by a gram-negative bacterium that we'll spend some time discussing is that of the spotted fever, rickettsiosis. There's more than one. Rocky Mountain spotted fever is the most severe. You may be somewhat familiar with this as being a tick-borne disease. So of all the nasty things you can get from tick bites, this is one of them. These are gram-negative bacteria, but unlike extracellular pathogens, these are intracellular parasites that live within the host cells, and they avoid digestion by the host cell by evading or escaping the phagosome before lysis with that vesicle called the lysosome that contains the digestive enzymes. Symptoms of Rocky Mountain spotted fever include this petechial rash all over the body, including the hands and feet, the soles of the hand and feet. So this can distinguish it from things like chickenpox or measles. And as far as how does it cause disease, oh, here's a good one here showing a cell. Here's the cell's nucleus, and these are all rickettsia, okay, in the cytoplasm. So as they grow and lyse the host cells just by virtue of their sheer numbers, they're able to spread to other cells. And although they don't secrete any toxins which cause damage, the damage or the destruction of the blood vessels causes blood and fluids to leak into tissues, and then death can result from hypotension, low blood pressure, and organ failure because they're not getting the nutrients and oxygen that they need. A person, let's go back here, with Rocky Mountain spotted fever is typically diagnosed by serological testing, if you recall the ELISAs that you learned about in lab, and they can be treated with various types of antibiotics, but the best, again, protection, again, is prevention, use of ticks, and avoiding tick-infested areas. It's kind of hard to do in our section of Virginia, but permethrin is a good choice to treat your clothes. And we do that with our kids when we send them off to camp. Okay, there's a couple of slides in your book which kind of outline the progression of Rocky Mountain spotted fever, again beginning with the bite from an infected tick. The rickettsia that are in the saliva is transferred to the bloodstream. And even though your book says that this takes at least 6 hours, I would not take that as gospel. I know some people that don't even know that they've been or remember being bitten by a tick that have developed this. So I think a tick bite from any length of time is of concern. So these travel then through the blood vessels, and the endothelial cells which line these small vessels then become the host cells for the rickettsia to enter into and then escape into the cytoplasm. So they, again, multiply rapidly and infect other cells, their neighboring cells. And in doing so, the cells die, and that causes the blood to leak into the tissues, causing these little tiny hemorrhages called petechia, which again is characteristic of the Rocky Mountain spotted fever. The interesting thing, if you've thought about it, from the name you would certainly think that this is a disease found primarily, or at least abundantly, in the Rocky Mountains. In fact, this is most prevalent in the eastern part of the United States in the Appalachians. In this map, the incidence is plotted where the darker the orange color here, the greater the number of cases, and this is from 2002, 12-year period, to 2014. You'll notice that here we in Virginia have quite a number, high incidence of cases of Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And in fact, a friend of mine contracted this and then was treated with ciprofloxacin, and she actually hasn't really recovered from that. Actually, from the treatment with the Cipro was worse, I think, than the rickettsia. So here's one of these. Think about it. Why do most cases of Rocky Mountain spotted fever occur in May, June, and July? Should be pretty obvious. Okay, so the last one before we move on to the viral diseases of the skin is cat scratch disease. It's because I know a lot of us are animal lovers, but animal ownership or contact with feral cats does have its risks, and this is one of them. The bacterium is a gram-negative, facultative, and like rickettsia, an intracellular pathogen. Like rickettsia, it doesn't produce exotoxins necessarily, but the LPS, the endotoxin in the outer membrane of this gram-negative bacterium, of course, can have its own adverse effects on the immune system, inducing fever and swollen lymph nodes, as well as abnormal blood clotting and so on. So the general appearance, or the way this tends to manifest itself, is there's whatever lymph node is closest to the bite or the scratch where the pathogen is introduced. That lymph node becomes swollen. The name for that is lymphoadenopathy. Fortunately, this condition can be treated by antibiotics, but in some cases, especially when this occurs on the face, there have been instances where the optic nerve becomes infected and blindness can result. So best advice is to wash a site of a cat scratch or bite under all circumstances. Okay, so the last part of this chapter, and again, we're not going to look at all of them, so just some of the major ones of interest, some viral diseases of the skin and wounds. And in contrast to many of the bacterial conditions, which we have seen cause localized conditions, in contrast, viral diseases tend to be systemic. That means that the symptoms and signs of the disease can be manifested throughout the body. And we'll give you some ideas why that may be the case. One of the most historically important viruses of all time was the variola virus, or smallpox virus. This has had a huge impact on the development of civilizations and colonization of the world. You may remember that smallpox blankets were believed to have been given to Native Americans by the president of that time, Andrew Jackson, and really represents a form of bioterrorism, as really all of the Native Americans had no innate immunity to the pox virus. So in addition to smallpox, cowpox, and monkeypox can also cause mild forms of disease in humans. Remember, the cowpox was originally the vaccine used by Edward Jenner to induce immunity against smallpox. So that's where, again, this word vaccine comes from. That was the vaccinia virus. Smallpox is also notable because it is the first human disease to be completely eradicated. There are no longer any cases or any reservoirs of smallpox. The virus is maintained in, I believe, 2 to 3 BSL-4 labs, one in the United States, one in Russia, and there may be one some other place. So there is a possible concern that this could be retrieved and resuscitated in some form as an agent of bioterrorism. But for now, the world is free of the smallpox plague. Okay, not so for herpes. Many of us are all too familiar with oral herpes, which causes fever blisters on the mouth and the lips. These are small lesions that are slow spreading, but really annoying and painful, and they do reoccur in response to certain stress factors, menstrual cycles, stress, and so on. The causative agent of oral herpes is human herpes virus 1, or HHV1, while a related form, HHV2, as you may know, is primarily associated with the genital herpes. These produce various proteins that act as virulence factors and cause those cells to lyse, resulting in cell death and resulting inflammation around the area of the infection. The issue really is that, let me go back to this one here, that after the initial outbreak, the virus can reside in the neural ganglia, and this is where they kind of hang out, where they establish a latent infection, which again can be reactivated, and the virus physically travels back along the nerves to the site of reinfection.